The rising cost of food, it continues to be a concern across the world, not just South Africa. The Russia-Ukraine war has contributed to the increase of commodities, including wheat, which is a staple food in many of the countries. Now, food price inflation has raised concerns about people's ability to afford basic foodstuffs. So, to try and understand exactly how inflation is calculated, the visiting professor at the Wits Business School is Professor Jannie Rossouw, and he joins us now for that conversation. Prof, good morning to you. We're going to get into the conversation about inflation, which is what we've invited you here for. But I can't resist the temptation, Prof, if you have been listening at all to the audit outcomes, particularly of municipalities. The situation appears to be going from bad to worse. Do you have any opinion on how our municipalities are run?
Good morning, Coley, and good morning to all the viewers. Indeed, I have a view. I've reached the conclusion that the ANC strategy of 25 years ago to create these mega municipalities where they moved small municipalities into bigger entities simply backfired. These bigger entities are not functioning optimally, not giving service delivery to people, and we should rethink the whole municipal model to get back to smaller municipalities again, to get service delivery closer to the people. So at the moment we have a situation where municipalities simply do not deliver the services that people pay for, such as, for instance, wastewater treatment.
Prof, let's then get into this discussion where we're going to talk about inflation. Firstly, explain it to us in layman's terms. What exactly is inflation before you tell us about how it's calculated?
In short, inflation is a process of increase in the general price level in the country. In other words, prices of goods and services purchased by households and consumers increase consistently over time.
And how is it calculated? Add into that response, Prof, the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war, geopolitics. How do they fit into this?
Well, the first part of your question, of course, on how inflation is calculated. Inflation is calculated on the basis of a consumer price index, where a consumer price index measures the spending of an average household in a country. And when there are changes in the price level in the consumer price index for the so-called CPI, that is regarded as the rate of inflation. Now, of course, the war in the Ukraine, the Russian-Ukrainian war, has resulted in disruptions, especially in food supplies. Of course, Ukraine is an important food producer, and as a result of that, food prices internationally and inevitably in South Africa started increasing. Now, when we look at the composition of the inflation rate, it's obvious to us that we don't only have an overall inflation rate calculated for South Africa, but also for different income groups. And from looking at the inflation rate for different income groups, we can see that food price inflation hits poor people very hard.
And that's the point, that's the main thrust of your article, that poor people are going to be affected the most. But you also point out that spending patterns among South African households differs according to, the income. And we all know the rate or the scourge of inequality in South Africa. It is one of the most unequal societies in the world. Talk us through that.
Indeed, Coley, in South Africa, households are divided into 10 deciles. It's a statistical analysis of Statistics South Africa. So I will only focus on the top and bottom deciles, or if you wish, the richest, wealthiest, and poorest households. In the case of the poorest household, expenditure on food accounts for about 50% of their total expenditure. In the case of the richest, most wealthy households, food expenditure accounts for just over 10%, which already shows that poor people are much harder hit by food inflation than more wealthy people. So it follows automatically that any initiative to contain inflation will benefit all South Africans, but particularly poor South Africans, if food price inflation can be contained.
And you've spent, I think, about 3 paragraphs talking about why curbing inflation is important. We're going to talk about that in a moment, but just, I think, explain it to us as to how soon South African households, particularly the poorest of the poor, are likely to see this bite even more, because already the situation is dire.
Yeah, of course. Inflation measures in a cumulative way. So next year's inflation is added to this year's inflation. So each following year of higher inflation makes it more difficult for households to make ends meet on limited income. So inflation to be contained remains very important in South Africa and internationally all of a sudden. I've also pointed out that a country like the United States of America had very low inflation for about 4 decades, and suddenly, as of late, their inflation rate is higher than the inflation rate in South Africa. So it's necessary for the Reserve Bank to remain diligent, to keep inflation to the inflation target range, and to make sure that inflation expectations do not change, because people respond according to their expectations of future inflation.
And the response from government, Prof, we're now dealing with how to curb inflation. The response from government always is that we are not in control of international factors that affect the pricing of either petrol here in South Africa or indeed foodstuffs. When we see, for example, the talk in the United States that the interest rate hiking cycle there would most likely go to 75 basis points, you're like, what? That's unheard of. How is that likely to affect developing countries like us here? Because often it is said that when the U.S. sneezes, the entire world catches a cold.
The problem in the United States is that their central bank, the Federal Reserve Board, fell behind the rising trend in inflation. Their view was that inflation is transitionary. I don't agree with any description of inflation as transitionary. In my view, inflation is always a clear and present danger. And from the side of the authorities, central banks are responsible for containing inflation. Central banks should always be diligent in containing inflation. The South African Reserve Bank has been diligent in containing inflation. We've already seen interest rates moving in South Africa. But if rates increase sharply in the United States, inevitably other countries in the world will have to follow. As you've said, when the US sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold.
Professor Jannie Rossouw, thank you very much for those insights. He is the visiting professor at the Business School at the University of Witwatersrand. Thank you indeed for that simpler explanation of how inflation works.